All right, today we're diving into something pretty fascinating. It's called MarsProject.pdf. And it's this really interesting blend of hard science, like rocket science, and a fictional story about, you guessed it, a mission to Mars.
Yeah, and what makes it even cooler is that it was written way back in 1949 by Wernher von Braun, one of the absolute pioneers of rocketry. And the crazy thing is he was thinking about a Mars mission happening in the 1980s.
Seriously, the 1980s. That's wild, even for someone as forward-thinking as Von Braun. So, like, what are we even doing here today? Well, I think our mission, if you want to call it that, is to kind of dig into von Braun's vision, the tech he imagined, and all the challenges he thought we'd face trying to conquer Mars.
Such a cool peek into a potential future, right?
Yeah.
Like seen through the lens of 1949. And I got to remember the context too. World War II had just wrapped up, the Cold War was starting, and space exploration was just a baby.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a time of upheaval and possibility, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so enough context. Let's get into von Braun's grand vision. What kind of Mars mission was he dreaming up?
He was thinking about a massive, like truly massive international collaboration, like a global effort. And get this, completely focused on science and engineering. No politics involved.
Hold on. A Mars mission with no budgets and no bureaucracy?
Yeah.
That's got to be one of the most idealistic visions I've ever heard. Was he, like, trying to make a statement about global politics at the time?
It makes you think for
Yeah.
sure. He basically argues that a project this huge, something that could unite everyone towards one goal, could actually rise above all the political divisions. He thought that if nations could focus on one shared challenge, they could work together to do something really incredible.
It's a beautiful idea. I admire the sentiment, but I'm just not sure. Could any project ever escape politics completely? Even one about science and exploration?
Right, and it's a question we still haven't figured out. How do we balance the interests of individual countries with cooperating globally, especially when it comes to big, ambitious science projects like this?
Totally. Okay, well, let's shift gears a bit from the dream team to the actual nuts and bolts. Von Braun had some pretty out there ideas about how to even get to Mars. Like this whole Lunetta concept, it sounds like something straight out of Star Trek.
Lunetta was key to his plan. Imagine, like, a man-made moon orbiting Earth, and it's like a giant gas station and rest stop for trips to other planets. Essentially a massive space station, but built specifically for going to Mars and beyond.
A man-made moon. That's not just a pit stop, that's a total game changer. What made him think that was even possible in the 1980s?
It just shows how bold his thinking was. This was, what, just a few years after World War II? Rockets were still in their early days. And yet von Braun saw Lunetta as this essential stepping stone. Not just for Mars, but maybe even farther out in the solar system.
So Lunetta was like a launch pad for even bigger expeditions.
Exactly. And it gets even wilder. In his story, Lunetta has this, well, darker side. In one of the world wars in the story, it plays a pretty terrifying role.
Hold up, what do you mean World War?
In von Braun's fictional narrative, this Lunetta, this man-made moon, it becomes a launch platform for atomic bombs, turning it into a weapon with, well, unimaginable destructive power.
Whoa. Atomic bombs from space? That's pretty chilling. Did he actually think that was a real possibility?
Well, it kind of reflects how scared everyone was of nuclear war back then, during the Cold War. Even though von Braun wrote it as fiction, it brings up some huge ethical questions about, like, the militarization of space, questions that are even more important today, I think.
No doubt. It's a good reminder that any technology can be used for good or bad, and the choices we make about how we use it, they matter.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's say we have this Lunetta, this orbital base. How did von Braun think we'd actually navigate through space? I mean, it's not like there are road signs pointing the way to Mars, are there?
He was relying on something called Keplerian ellipses. Instead of going in a straight line, he imagined a curved path from Earth to Mars, using the sun's gravity to help us along the way.
Oh, like a cosmic slingshot, using the sun's gravity to speed up the spacecraft toward Mars.
Exactly. He also talked about making tiny adjustments to the spacecraft's speed along the way, like fine-tuning the trajectory to make sure it arrives safely.
It sounds ridiculously complex. Did he really think those kinds of precise calculations were possible back then?
Remember, this is before computers as we know them. All those calculations would have been done by hand, using slide rules and math formulas. It's pretty amazing how much detail and precision von Braun had in his vision.
Yeah, that's mind-blowing. To even think about a mission that complex with all those tiny details using only what they had in the 1940s, it's just remarkable.
Yeah, and it shows you that even with limited technology, humans can do incredible things when they put their minds to it.
So true. All right, well, we've talked about the vision and the journey. Now let's talk about the destination itself. Mars. What did von Braun have to say about the red planet?
He described Mars as a world of extremes: harsh, unforgiving, thin atmosphere, freezing temperatures, and hints that it was once a much wetter place.
So, beautiful, but dangerous, too. Was he just going off the science they had back then, or did he get a little creative with it?
He used the best science available,
Yeah.
for sure, but he also used his imagination, trying to make Mars come alive for people.
I see. Now, he mentions these canals on Mars in the document, and he even hints that they might be, intelligently designed. Was he buying into that whole Martian civilization theory that was popular back then?
Oh yeah, the canals were a big debate in the early 1900s. Some astronomers thought they were proof of a super advanced civilization on Mars, like waterways built to move water from the poles. Von Braun presented arguments for it, but he also said we needed to investigate more.
So he wasn't totally sold, but he was open to it. It's funny how much our understanding of Mars has changed since then.
Right. We know now that the canals were just an optical illusion. But von Braun's willingness to think about different explanations, that shows how important it is to question everything and reevaluate what we think we know as we get new evidence.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this awesome vision of a Mars mission, this incredible Lunetta base with its potential for both good and, let's be honest, kind of scary consequences. But what about the practical stuff? Did von Braun acknowledge how difficult this whole thing would actually be?
Oh, absolutely. A big chunk of the document is about the money and the politics. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he thought it was worth it.
So he wasn't naive, but he really believed in this mission. What were his main arguments for doing something this huge?
He said a Mars mission would be a giant leap forward for science and technology. It would inspire new inventions and push the limits of what we know.
And he also saw it as a way to bring humanity together, right? A chance to rise above politics and work together for the good of everyone.
Exactly. He thought a Mars mission could be that thing that makes everyone cooperate, a symbol of our shared future as humans on Earth.
That's a powerful vision, and it still resonates with us today. But even with the best intentions, there are always practical things to consider. Did von Braun address those too?
He did. He talked about money worries, the possibility of conflicts, and the need to work together internationally. He knew a Mars mission wouldn't be just about science and engineering. It would be about politics and ethics, too.
So he wasn't just a dreamer, but also a pragmatist. He knew that making this vision real would take careful planning, lots of collaboration, and a willingness to face some tough challenges.
For sure. And he didn't shy away from those challenges at all. He saw them as part of the journey, chances for us to grow and learn.
All right, we've talked about the vision, the journey, and the destination, but what about the people involved? What did von Braun say about the astronauts who would actually go on this dangerous mission?
He knew that a Mars mission would be incredibly tough on the crew, both physically and mentally. A lot of the document is about the challenges of living in space for so long, like weightlessness, radiation, and the mental strain of being cooped up in a tiny spacecraft for months.
He was writing this decades before anyone even went into orbit. What did he know about space travel's challenges?
He understood that sending people to Mars wasn't just about building rockets. It was also about keeping those people healthy and safe.
So he cared about the human side of things, too, not just the tech. Did he have any ideas for how to deal with those challenges?
Yeah, he did. He imagined spacecraft with artificial gravity, radiation shielding, and systems that could recycle air and water.
Artificial gravity. In 1949, that sounds so futuristic. Did he really think something like that was possible?
That's how forward-thinking he was. He knew that long trips in space would need some pretty crazy solutions.
So he was thinking about the big picture, not just getting to Mars, but making sure the astronauts could actually survive the whole trip.
Exactly. He knew that a Mars mission wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. And being ready for the long haul was just as important as getting there in the first place.
It's amazing how many of the things he worried about back then are still relevant today as we keep pushing further into space.
His work reminds us that space exploration isn't just about how cool the tech is. It's about human resilience, our ability to adapt, and our deep-down desire to explore the unknown.
So well said. And I think that's a great place to wrap up part one of our deep dive into Wernher von Braun's Mars project. We've talked about his vision, the challenges he saw coming, and how much detail he put into his plan. But there's still so much more to uncover. From how he designed the spacecraft to his ideas about exploring Mars once we actually get there. So join us for part two, where we'll keep digging deeper into the technical and scientific stuff in von Braun's Mars project.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Wernher von Braun's Mars project. Last time we got into his vision for a Mars mission, all the challenges he thought we'd run into, and his pretty wild idea for a lunar base, Lunetta. So this time, let's zoom in a bit on the actual trip to Mars, and how von Braun thought we could overcome all those technical hurdles.
One thing that really stood out to me was his idea for a modular spacecraft, like building blocks for the journey to Mars.
Yeah.
Modular design. That's interesting. Break that down for us a bit.
Okay, so he had this three-stage rocket system in mind. Each stage has a specific job and detaches when it's done. So the first stage, the biggest one, that lifts the whole thing off the ground and up into the atmosphere.
Okay.
Then the second stage kicks in, gives it the final push to escape Earth's gravity. And finally, the third stage, with the crew and all the supplies, that's the one that continues on to Mars.
So it's like shedding layers as it goes,
Yeah.
each one doing its part and then falling away. Super efficient. But how did he think we could power something that massive for a trip that long?
He was picturing liquid-fueled rockets, kind of like the ones we use today, but with some key differences. He specifically talked about using hydrazine and nitric acid as fuel. Pretty advanced for the time.
Hydrazine and nitric acid, those are some pretty serious chemicals. Weren't there like safety concerns about using stuff that volatile?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They're highly reactive. Got to be careful. But they also give you a ton of thrust, which you definitely need for a mission this big. Von Braun knew the risks, don't get me wrong. He put a lot of thought into the safety measures and how to engineer the whole thing to use those fuels safely.
So a calculated risk, I guess. Power versus safety. But it shows he was willing to push the limits to make it happen.
Yeah, he was all about pushing limits, but always thinking about the risks involved, too.
All right, so we've got this giant three-stage rocket powered by these super powerful but kind of dangerous chemicals, and it's hurtling towards Mars. But what about the actual journey through space? How did Von Braun think we could navigate that vast emptiness?
He knew navigating to Mars was going to be tricky. He thought we should use these things called Keplerian ellipses to map out the course, taking advantage of the sun's gravity to help us along the way.
Wait, Keplerian ellipses? I feel like I've heard of that. Remind me what those are again.
Basically, it means traveling in a curve, not a straight line, using the gravity of the sun to kind of slingshot the spacecraft towards Mars. Saves fuel, makes the whole trip more efficient.
Okay, I get it. So it's not just about raw power, it's about using the forces of the universe to your advantage.
Smart. Did von Braun account for, like, mid-course corrections in case they got off track?
Of course. He knew you had to make adjustments along the way to stay on target and make sure they actually reached Mars safely.
It sounds like a crazy, complicated dance of calculations and adjustments. How did he think they'd do all that before computers?
That's what's so impressive. All those calculations would have been done by hand with slide rules and math equations. It's just insane how precise they were trying to be with such limited tools.
Yeah, talk about dedication and ingenuity. Okay, so let's say they make it through space and get close to Mars.
Yeah.
How did von Braun picture actually landing on the red planet?
He knew that landing on Mars would be tough. The atmosphere is thin and the gravity is different. So he designed these special landing boats. They could operate in space and in Mars's atmosphere. Landing boats. Seriously, tell me more about these things. How could they work in two totally different environments?
Well, he wanted to use wings for gliding through the atmosphere, so the landing boats could come down like a plane. But get this. Once they were on the ground, the wings would detach, turning the boat back into a streamlined rocket for the return trip to orbit.
Whoa, a shape-shifting spacecraft. That's like something out of a movie. But actually a really clever solution to the problem of landing and taking off from Mars.
It shows how he could think outside the box, combining different technologies to solve a problem.
But even with that design, weren't there still concerns about how harsh Mars is? It's a completely alien world.
Oh, he knew about all that. The thin atmosphere, the freezing temperatures, no air to breathe. He spent a lot of time thinking about life support systems that could keep the crew alive on the surface.
So he was thinking about the whole picture, not just getting there, but surviving once they did. What were some of his ideas for those life support systems?
He imagined closed-loop systems for recycling air and water to make sure the crew had enough supplies. He also addressed radiation by building shielding into the spacecraft.
Recycling air and water, radiation shielding. We take that for granted in space travel today. But back then, that was cutting-edge stuff. He was so ahead of his time.
He really was a visionary, coming up with solutions that we still use today.
Speaking of visions, one thing that really stuck with me was his idea for artificial gravity. We talked about it a bit before, but can you go into more detail about how he thought we could create gravity in space?
He thought we could use rotating sections of the spacecraft to create centrifugal force, which would basically feel like gravity. He even did the calculations to figure out how fast and how big these sections would need to be to make it comfortable.
So he wasn't just messing around, he actually did the math to see if it would work.
He was serious about his work. He wanted to make sure his ideas were based on real science and engineering.
And it's crazy how many of his ideas are still relevant today.
Almost 80 years later.
It just goes to show how much of an impact he had on space exploration.
His work still inspires us to think big and push the boundaries of what's possible with space travel.
All right, we've covered a lot. Modular spacecraft design, landing on Mars, life support systems, artificial gravity. But what about actually exploring Mars once they got there? What were von Braun's thoughts on doing science and exploring the Martian landscape?
He wanted to use a mix of spacecraft and ground vehicles. Remember those landing boats we talked about? He imagined them with detachable wings so they could be both spacecraft and atmospheric gliders.
Oh yeah, those multi-purpose landing boats. They could go back and forth between orbit and the surface. But did he have any plans for, like, specialized vehicles to drive around on Mars?
He did. He called them caterpillars, designed specifically for navigating the Martian terrain.
Caterpillars. Were those like the rovers we use today?
They were more for transportation and logistics, moving supplies and equipment over long distances. He thought they'd be essential for setting up a base camp, so the crew could explore further out from there.
So less about doing science experiments and more about getting a foothold on Mars, like the first steps towards a permanent human presence.
Exactly. He really emphasized the importance of creating a sustainable presence on Mars, not just a quick visit. This mission was just the beginning for him, maybe even the start of colonizing the Red Planet.
Wow, that's ambitious. But what about the science itself? What kind of research did he want the astronauts to do on Mars?
He focused on studying Mars's geology, its atmosphere, and looking for any signs of life, past or present. This was way before we sent our first robots to Mars, so there was so much we didn't know.
It must have been exciting, imagining what those first explorers might find. New landscapes, new discoveries, maybe even aliens.
Yeah, it's a pretty captivating vision, and it's clear he was driven by curiosity, wanting to learn more about Mars and our place in the universe.
Okay, so we have this amazing picture of exploring Mars, using landing boats and caterpillar vehicles to get around and do research. But he also understood the political side of things, right? The potential for conflict, both on Earth and maybe even on Mars.
Absolutely. He knew that countries might fight over control of Mars and its resources. He even brought up the possibility of conflict with extraterrestrials, if we ever meet them.
So even in this hopeful vision of space exploration, he was thinking about some pretty serious ethical and political questions.
He got it. Space exploration isn't just about technology. It's also about being responsible humans as we venture out into the unknown.
Right. It reminds us that space exploration is a human thing.
And it makes us ask some big questions about our values, our goals, and what it means to be human in a vast universe.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Wernher von Braun's Mars project. So far, we've covered his big vision for getting to Mars, the super detailed plan for the trip itself, and even some of the challenges of just, surviving on the red planet. But now I think it's time to really dig into the heart of it all, the tech, the stuff that von Braun imagined would make this whole crazy dream possible.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing how back in 1949, he was already thinking about stuff like spacecraft propulsion, life support systems, even artificial gravity. He just knew that a mission this big would need some serious breakthroughs.
Totally. We talked about his ideas for liquid-fueled rockets, right? Using hydrazine and nitric acid. Pretty intense stuff. But did he get into the nitty-gritty of how those engines would actually work?
He did, yeah. He had this idea for something called a regenerative cooling system. Basically, the fuel, which is super cold, circulates around the combustion chamber, which gets incredibly hot, by the way, before the fuel is injected and burned. Okay. And this does two things. One, it keeps the engine from melting under all that heat. And two, it warms up the fuel, which makes it burn more efficiently.
So it's like killing two birds with one stone, solving the heat problem and getting more power out of the engine at the same time.
Exactly. Just really smart engineering, making the most of the technology they had.
It makes you wonder what he could have done with the stuff we have today.
Oh, I know, right? Advanced materials, computer simulations, all that. But even with what he had, he came up with some pretty amazing systems. Like, he also figured out how to control the spacecraft's attitude and trajectory in space.
Attitude and trajectory. So, like steering and staying on course? How did you think we could do that without all the fancy sensors and computers we have now?
Well, he thought about using gyroscopes and these little reaction control thrusters. The gyroscopes would help keep the spacecraft oriented the right way, and the thrusters would give it little bursts of force to adjust its path.
So like tiny nudges to keep it pointing in the right direction. Sounds kind of delicate.
It is. It takes a deep understanding of physics and how things move in orbit. And von Braun definitely had that.
Okay, well, we've talked about propulsion and navigation, but what about the most basic challenge of all? How to keep people alive in space. It's not exactly the most hospitable environment.
You're telling me. He knew they'd need some serious life support systems. A big part of his document is about closed-loop systems for recycling air and water, and then dealing with waste, temperature control, all of that.
So like building a little bubble of Earth out there in the void.
Pretty much. And remember, this is way before we had space stations. He was already thinking about the long game, how to make space travel sustainable for humans.
You know, one of the coolest things to me is this whole artificial gravity idea. We've touched on it before, but can you tell us more about how he thought we could actually create gravity in space?
Sure. His plan was to have sections of the spacecraft rotate, to create centrifugal force, which would feel like gravity. He even calculated the speed and the size those sections would need to be to make it comfortable for the crew.
So he wasn't just throwing ideas around, he actually crunched the numbers.
Yeah, he was all about the details. He wanted to make sure his ideas were grounded in real science.
It's amazing how many of those ideas are still being talked about today.
It's a testament to his vision and how far ahead he was thinking.
It really is.
And, his work still motivates us to think big about what's possible in space.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into von Braun's Mars project, I gotta say, I'm just in awe of his ambition and how much he believed in our ability to solve any problem we come across.
It's an inspiring message, for sure. Even when things seem impossible, we can dream big, come up with new ideas, and reach for the stars.
Yeah, and that message is just as relevant today as it was back in 1949. We may not have made it to Mars yet, but thanks to people like von Braun, we're getting closer. So next time you look up at the night sky and see all those stars, remember Wernher von Braun and let his imagination inspire you to chase your own impossible dreams.